Welcome to Recovery Radio by Landmark Recovery with your host, Zach Crouch. In this program, we'll discuss the root causes and treatments of alcohol and substance addiction, speak with experts in related fields, and help navigate the road to recovery. Now, here's the host of Recovery Radio, Zach Crouch.
Hi, I'm Zach Crouch, and you're listening to Landmark Recovery Radio, your source for addiction and recovery news and knowledge. You can find us online wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe to get the most up-to-date information from leading experts. We have guests Lin and Aaron Sternlicht joining us on the podcast today. Lin and Aaron are addiction specialists based in New York City at their private practice, Family Addiction Specialist. Both Lin and Aaron have extensive experience working with individuals suffering with substance use disorder. Lin specializes in the needs of prominent high net worth individuals and their families. And Aaron has extensive experience in helping individuals facing legal issues pertaining to drugs and or alcohol, such as DUIs and DWIs. Lin, Aaron, it's a pleasure. And obviously, we're in the middle of this pandemic. We're really...
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. You cut out there.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure. So if you can, tell us about your services, yourselves, and what inspired you both to pursue careers that specialize in addiction.
Sure. So we're both licensed mental health counselors, and I guess I'll briefly tell you about how I got here. I'm a person in long-term recovery from drugs and alcohol, and I'll tell you in a quick nutshell, my addiction started with food from a young age, and it increased over time to the point where I was 23 years old, where I was nearly 300 pounds, and I was overweight, obese my entire life, and I turned to alcohol and drugs as a way to cope with my low self-esteem, with my depression, with all my insecurities, and all the things that went along with being overweight my whole life. And I found myself at a point where I ended up going to treatment. However, I went to treatment unwillingly through a family intervention. However, while I was in that treatment center, there was a light switch that went off in my head. It was kind of an eye-opening moment where I realized that not only can I live a life without drugs and alcohol, but that I can live a thriving, meaningful, purposeful life without alcohol and drugs. And part of that was very much And part of that was very much inspired by the staff at the treatment center. So everybody from the doctors, the nurses, the clinicians, all the way down to the fitness trainer, I would say I think 99% of them were in recovery themselves. So, when they shared their personal stories with me during their, downtime, I was very inspired by that because number one, it showed me that, if they could recover, I could recover as well. And number two, it showed me that I could help other people through my own experience. Prior to that, I never really found much meaning and purpose in life. And obviously that's something that fueled my addiction. However, I realized that I could find meaning and purpose by giving back and helping others with addictive disorders. So basically, as soon as I left that treatment center, I started applying to schools. I ended up going back to school. I got my master's in mental health counseling. I became a licensed therapist, and I've been, working in this field ever since. And Lin also has a very unique and inspiring story, which shows the other side of addiction, which is often not as much spoken about.
Yeah, for me, like when I first made a career transition from business to kind of therapy and psychology world, it was actually never my intention to focus on substance abuse. So I initially pursued higher education to focus on mental health. But by the time I went to grad school, till by the time I graduated, my life was turned upside down. So even in the very best program, I was learning about substance abuse and I wasn't, pursuing formal education. There was not much resources or data pertaining to high functioning alcoholism. So therefore I missed all of the signs and symptoms and, the right steps to take, right? So those lack of resources, guidance and resources at the time really inspire me to raise awareness in high functioning alcoholism, as well as, working with this population and helping families. So in a nutshell, I was married to someone at the time who worked on Wall Street, who was very high achieving and high functioning, who struggled with drinking issues. There was a 7-figure salary. We had a beautiful apartment, looking over Central Park. We had a beautiful child. So, outside looking in, right? We lived very desirable life.
The absolute American dream, right?
Yes, right. So even for me, it was very confusing and challenging because, the way his alcoholism kind of progressed was very sneaky and very subtle, right? It didn't really meet the criteria or the image of someone who struggled with alcoholism. A lot of the times, he woke up 5:30 in the morning, way before I did, right? He was a good, involved father. There was no signs of, violence or domestic violence. He was a wine collector. There was always like beautiful wine tasting and pairing. And, he was very knowledgeable about wine. So it really, really was confusing. And, I didn't really know where to turn to.
Sure.
So there was like no visible or overt signs of dysfunction at the time, but it was very progressive, very sneaky, and very confusing at the time. So, having gone through those experiences combined with my education, I really wanted to devote my career to help, raise awareness as well as like treat and work with this population.
Yeah, I want to come back also to a couple pieces. First, with you, Aaron, you mentioned that you just kind of were. It sounds like an intervention of some kind, or were coerced into treatment. That first experience that you talked about, and I didn't know this, but I think that I want to make this clear to our listeners. The data suggests that it doesn't matter how someone gets into treatment, whether they're coerced or not. It really depends on when they're there, what they get from the experience. In fact, there's no data that will show that if a person decides one day, which most people don't, hey, I need to go to treatment, that they are somehow better off in terms of long-term sobriety than those that say were given the option to go to treatment through an intervention. So I think that's important.
Yes, absolutely.
I also think that your experience too with seeing people, because I think a lot of folks who come into the recovery process, they're so beat down and shame ridden that they think these people in front of me, these professionals, especially the doctors, and I think that you mentioned from the top down, as you said, everybody, 99% or so of the people that were there at your facility were in recovery, and that's a big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people have the idea or notion, if they are an alcoholic or drug addict, that only a person who is in recovery themselves can really help them. But I've found that that's really kind of just a form of resistance. Usually people use that as an excuse to not get well because, studies show over and over that it doesn't matter if the clinician is in recovery or not. So that's an important point. And yeah, going back to interventions, you're absolutely right. Studies suggest that it doesn't matter how you end up in treatment. I sometimes say that, some feel the fire and some see the light. So meaning that, some might face enough consequences in their life where they realize, okay, it's time to change. For me, I faced significant consequences throughout my life, but it was not time for me to change. However, once I cleared my head a bit and had that time to reflect, I did see the light. So, it can go both ways, absolutely. And whatever works, everybody is unique and everybody is different.
I appreciate that. Lin, you mentioned also that you were in business prior to this particular career. Has that helped you out in working with the population? You mentioned, in the beginning, that you work a lot with prominent sort of high net worth folks. How's that informed your work with them?
No, actually, I think it's actually a perfect mix for me because when I was in business world, I was playing everyone's therapist, right? And then people are saying that you're in the wrong office. And when I was in graduate school to become a therapist, everyone was telling me you're too businessy, right? So now I feel like I have a perfect marriage between those two. And I really understand and identify with people under a lot of pressure to perform and excel. And so, yeah, I think it's really good. It's only a plus
In your opinion, Lynn, do you think that there are uh, sort of more resources, I guess would be the best word I could come up with, to hide the addiction and alcoholism, especially for people who are high functioning, such as the case with your ex-husband? Has that been your experience a lot with working with families and addicts or people with substance use disorder?
Absolutely. First of all, it's really easy for them to be in denial, and it's also really easy for them to hide their malfunction and dysfunction with their drinking and drug use. Because, say like a regular working mom, if she were to miss a pickup at her school, right, and she's persistently late or show up with a bloodshot eyes, the teachers will notice, right? The neighbors will notice, and someone will take a note of that. Whereas high functioning and also high net worth individuals, usually they have a team of people, staff members, helping them with day-to-day and mundane obligations and responsibilities. So no one's going to really notice if you don't pick up your kid because there is someone else to do that for you. And also, especially people are in more senior positions, their colleagues or, the people who work for them, they're very reluctant to confront them about their drinking.
What do you think that's about? The reluctancy?
Because, first of all, if you work for your boss and you're under their payroll, it's not easy for them to say, it's not easy for family members to confront them about their drinking, right? So imagine someone who's under their payroll and say, oh, hi, I just noticed that, you smell like alcohol, or, I noticed that you keep getting late with your meetings. They're less likely to confront. And one of the times I was approached by senior executives saying, I noticed that one of my colleagues is having a really serious problem, but I'm afraid to even suggest any kind of help because I don't want to offend them. I don't want to ruin any business relationships or deals moving forward because of this.
So the structure of the working environment and the relationships that are built really, they support the alcoholism.
Absolutely. And the heavy drinking is very normalized. And, client business dinners to business functions, it's very normalized. If you actually don't drink alcohol, you come off as like, okay, what's that person about? They're not drinking. They're not one of us, right? So it's that cultural aspect as well.
So even withstanding people who are not just even working on Wall Street, but just people who have successful careers, for that matter, do you see many of them struggling to see that they have a problem?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, on the surface, everything appears fine. They're working, they're financially responsible. They're taking care of their children or taking care of whatever obligations they have. So, why would they see that they have a problem? Because everything on the surface seems fine. Now, that being said, there's always something awry somewhere if somebody has a problem with alcohol. And I think we'll touch on that a little bit later. But since everything appears to be okay, they fail to see that they have a problem. And oftentimes when people think of having a problem with alcohol, they immediately think of the word alcoholic. And the term alcoholic itself can be very demeaning and very stigmatizing. It can conjure up images of a low-functioning individual, right? A lot of people automatically think of some bum on the street, somebody slurring their words, somebody that smells of alcohol, right, to a layperson. So since they don't fit into that box, they can continue to tell themselves that they don't have a problem. And so that's, it's a form of denial. And similarly, the family members, their friends, their colleagues are much less likely to confront them about their drinking because everything up here is normal and functioning and they don't fit into that box of being a quote unquote alcoholic.
So question for you both. How often do you two just check in with each other? Because we're working with my wife and I are both therapists actually, and we work and it's a stressful job, working in this population. Do you guys have those conversations together?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, we are oftentimes working as a team, number one. So we try to work with the entire family. So we're always case conferencing amongst ourselves. But on a personal side, we always practice what we preach. So we stress and emphasize holistic methods of treatment with our patients. So eating well, to exercising, to meditating, to proper sleep hygiene, all of that we really practice it ourselves. We try to help keep ourselves accountable of each other to practice those things because they all go a long way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you work in this field, practicing all of those things are really essential because, it's really hard to tell somebody else or help somebody else get well when you are not well yourself.
Truer words couldn't have been spoken.
And also not to, the reason why we're really practicing those, self-care routine is not to be like perfectionistic or have,
Sure.
Unrealistic standards for ourselves, but really to stay engaged and healthy. But also, we also remember to have fun and just have,
Right.
non-work related stuff and just family fun or just like going outside for a walk. And just simple things like that to cooking, we always like try to nourish ourselves so our entire life doesn't revolve around other people's problems.
And you guys got a couple good restaurants there in New York City, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
I want to talk just a little bit about that too, around the holistic practices piece.
Mm-hmm.
Are there things that you've been surprised by, maybe over the weeks, months, and years that you've practiced now that perhaps before you were just sort of maybe not poo-pooing, but you were just kind of like, yeah, it sounds nice, but maybe it's for somebody else?
For example, I was working with large groups of patients in rehab, and I noticed that people were on, sometimes like almost exact same medication regimen, right? And I noticed that some people are getting much, much better with their mental health and, in their recovery, and other people are doing very poorly. So I didn't really run clinical trials, but from just my observation, I really noticed that people who do practice self-care routine and they do much better. So even if people were to take exact same medications, exact same groups and exact same therapists, they tend to do much, much better because your, medication responds better to your holistic lifestyle changes. And also I know that for me, I just do perform. I am a much better mother, a much better partner, a much better therapist or helper when I do practice those skills.
Yeah. Yep. Aaron, anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when it comes to nutrition and fitness, those are things that I've kind of always known will make me feel better, right? When I'm eating well, I feel well. When I'm moving, I feel better. So those things did not surprise me. However, I think some things that surprised me along the way of, were really just kind of simple tools. So for example, let's say there's a person, they've never meditated before, they look down on it or whatever, or maybe, it seems something like they can't do. Something simply as taking 3 to 4 to 5 deep breaths in and out can have such an amazing effect on your, physiological and neurological effect on you that you'll really come out on the other side completely different. So just taking a few deep breaths, which is just something I love because you can practice it wherever you are. It's amazing how you can come out on the other side. And along with that is also just practicing gratitude, which is another thing you can do wherever you are. Just thinking about some things that you are grateful for, and not only thinking about them, but thinking about why you're grateful for them and really trying to feel it and, really value it. It just can totally change your mood. So those are a couple things that have really surprised me.
I think it's like. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
The two things that I've noticed was that, one thing, when I work with a prison population, high risk populations where people are so angry, they were deprived of basic needs and they're very frustrated with severe mental health and substance abuse issues. So when I started groups with just literally 1 minute meditation, I noticed huge improvement of, people who are supposed to be really angry and frustrated and dangerous. They responded much better, especially with the underserved population. And another thing that I wanted to point out was that, in treatment setting and, 12-step meetings, I've seen over and over, people emphasize on, like whatever keeps you sober, right? So what do they usually serve? Donuts and coffee with like Domino sugar, and smoking cigarettes, right? So initially they're like, oh, whatever keeps you sober from your drug of choice, whether it's drugs or alcohol. And then over time, they, completely neglect their nutrition and their physical health, and they become addicted to food, sugar, and cigarettes, which have more detrimental effects over time, where people report gaining 30, 40 pounds. And sometimes, unfortunately, they associate drug use with, oh, I look so much better. I used to feel so much better about myself, versus sobriety sucks, and I packed on 40 pounds, right? So that was also another thing to observe.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you guys sharing that. I think that the professionals as well as the lay folk listen to this podcast, and those in recovery are going to appreciate that. I want to talk a little bit about your practice, family addiction specialist. How many clients would you say, maybe not an exact number, but how many clients come to you because they notice that they have a problem, compared to, say, coming to you because their loved ones told them that they needed help?
Yeah, so I'll speak a little bit generally in the field of substance abuse from our experience, and then move on to our personal experience working with this specific population. I think substance abuse is by nature often a problem that people have that tells them they don't have a problem, right? Because human nature is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, and that goes for physiologically, neurologically, emotionally. And we live in a world where all too often people do that via substance, be it alcohol, drugs, or food. So with alcohol, the individual's brain is wired to continue using alcohol because it is helping them cope with something uncomfortable. So for that reason, people with substance abuse are less likely to get help themselves before there is an intervention of some sort. So I think that generally in the substance abuse field, there's often a split between people getting help themselves or people coming in via some sort of intervention. But in terms of high-functioning alcoholism and working with the population that we work with, I think that is only heightened and exacerbated. So if I had to guess, I'd say about 80% of our clients come via a family referral.
Number.
Because especially when it comes to high-functioning alcoholism and substance abuse, they maintain certain facade, or it's not even a facade. Sometimes they do perform exceptionally well in their career, right? So, but then who do they usually expose themselves with their most vulnerable part of their lives? Their family members, right? Yeah, so exactly. So their children, their parents, their spouses, usually they're the ones who really witness and see how progressively they, deteriorate. So yeah, family dynamic is changed forever because of that. So yeah, definitely loved ones and family members contact us for the most part.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up question to that. Do you find that among males and females that there's differences in terms of their fears? You mentioned a fear that might be of say, for instance, admitting that I have a problem, and then the consequence of or subsequent action of going to treatment. One of the fears for men might be losing their jobs. For women, it's potentially not being able to see their kids if something, if the parents are divorced, as an example. Do you find that pretty commonplace in your practice as well, that there's lots of themes that run through these fears?
Absolutely. I'm just grossly overgeneralizing, but let's just take an example. Like, for example, men, if, especially high functioning, high performing professional men, they feel good about themselves when they spend time with their weekends. When it comes to working mothers, especially executive mothers, they feel extremely guilty about not being a good enough mom when they work so much. So for example, I have worked with female executives who work over 12 hours, 7 days a week, and they feel extremely guilty about not being a good parent. So it also, research and data supports that, female executives in particular, they feel really pressured to fit in and do well and compete in male-dominated worlds. So they feel exceptional pressure. So I'm not saying that, women feel more or men feel less. I'm not simplifying that, but there's definitely additional pressure because of, feeling the motherhood, as
100%.
well as performing well in their job for women.
Very well put. Anything to add to that?
No, I don't think so. I think Lin said it very well.
What would you guys say defines a high functioning alcoholic, and why is it important that they seek help even if they're able to function, so to speak?
Yeah. So high functioning alcoholics are basically people who are able to maintain their life, be it their careers, their relationships, or other obligations, all the while displaying signs of alcoholism. And, generally speaking, for high functioning addicts or people who may suffer from high functioning depression or high functioning anxiety or other mental health issues, all are able to maintain their day-to-day lives, and in many cases even thrive while exhibiting the symptoms of their respective addiction or a mental health issue.
Yeah, a lot of high functioning clients that we have, they're usually very, very smart. They're driven, well educated, and they actually appear very well groomed and put together. So appearance-wise, it looks like they're functioning. However, unfortunately, we live in a society where we put so much emphasis on external achievement, acquiring, material wealth, right? But usually in that dynamic, usually their parenting ability, their marriage, their quality of family life has been heavily compromised. So, that notion of, I still do exceptionally well and I make a lot of money and I still hold my position at work while suffering, and compromising your family life, your spiritual, your emotional, your physical health is really, is something to really look into.
I was thinking as you go ahead, Aaron.
No, I was going to move on, but to why they should seek help. So
I just want to say real quick to Lin's point. As you were talking, Lin, I was thinking about somebody coming into your office. They're very well groomed. They're dressed to the nines. They probably smell good, and it's something I think unless you've worked with that population, it'd be really easy to get sucked into the sort of almost seduction story of what they're telling, because you have to separate that out, their problem, from the actual cultural norm or expectation that a lot of people have.
And also that's why I'm passionate about, kind of raising awareness and working with the population, is that people show, we're human beings. People show very little empathy for people who seem to be far more successful, far more wealthier, and they seem to have it all together. It's hard to show, that kind of compassion and empathy for those people. It's easier, as you said, to be lured, to be seduced, and kind of go along with their narrative.
Aaron, please expand upon what you were going to discuss.
Going back to your question about why they should seek help, which is a great question, and it's often a difficult question to answer, because if everything on the surface seems fine, then why should they seek help? So one thing I'll say about that is that the nature of alcoholism in itself is progressive in nature. So what that means is, the individual will require more alcohol over time in order to get the same desired effect. And I say that to say that their alcoholism will only progress and it will only get worse over time. So if they are already questioning, or if their loved ones are already questioning, maybe they do have some kind of problem with alcohol, then that means that it's only going to get worse later on. And, while things may appear functioning and normal on the surface, alcohol may be impacting them in ways that are not noticeable. So I'll give a perfect example, which is the damage that alcohol does to our internal organs, right? Especially to our liver, our pancreas, our heart, our brain, and those organs that are most impacted by alcohol.
Sure.
By the time somebody often receives help for alcoholism, there's often already a lot of damage done internally. So this is an example of why it's so important to seek help sooner rather than later. Some people who are in the field or in recovery say that alcoholism is a slow death, while opiates are often a faster death, and that's why oftentimes in treatment, when people are younger, sometimes that's more opiate addiction, and then when you have older people, it's more alcoholism. Unfortunately, we see so many cases of, cirrhosis of the liver as an example in older people because, and younger people too, but, oftentimes if they don't take care of that sooner than later, it's a really hard problem to fix down the road. And that's not only physically, but mentally as well.
And from purely like practical standpoint, once their professional reputation or performance has been damaged or ruined, it's really hard for them to kind of go back into workforce at that level. So if you're a senior executive and you can't just like go to rehab or go to treatment for 60 to 90 days and just go back online and find a job tomorrow.
Right.
So it's
that's
really,
6 months of the year process for some people.
Yes. And it's really not easy for them to just go online and submit resume and just be hired.
I want to touch back to Aaron about your point around the progression piece, especially as it relates to a couple of things. Number one, I talked to a lady recently, and this lady was 52, and she casually just called me up and said, "Yeah, I think I probably should get some help." And she really was convinced that just like outpatient therapy and AA meetings was going to be fine. And I was like, "Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about what you're doing." She said, "Well, I think right now, I'm having blackouts probably about once or twice a week right now. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, there's no way like you're going to be able to do this with just outpatient therapy in AA meetings." So the delusion I think that people live into as they have an addictive disorder like alcoholism, it does get progressive, and the delusion grows with that progression. And this lady did not get help. So I hope that she's still around, and I hope that she's gotten some help. But she was very convinced that, that this regimen of outpatient therapy and AA meetings was going to be enough.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, unfortunately, it's sad, and sometimes it's laughable when, if you work in the field or you're a person in recovery, because you see this all the time where, like you said, there's so much delusion or dysfunction that is so apparent to a person on the outsider, especially to professionals in the field. But, they don't see it as a problem. So, yeah, we see that a lot.
But at least for the lady, I would hope that she's at least engaged in outpatient, because once she is in treatment setting and she connects to other, counselors or clinicians or other people in recovery, she may see that, oh, you know what, this may not be enough for me, or someone may suggest that she needs higher level of care. But I would hope that she, is in treatment setting, which is like much better than, just her talking to someone else about it.
Right. Luckily, we did connect her with a therapist, and don't know if she actually followed up or not. But at this point, she's been given several different resources to at least consider. So, I guess the thing of it is with as you mentioned again, Aaron, about the progression piece, one question I was going to ask you both is, as you've worked with families and people with substance use disorder, do you find those that get into the recovery process go on to develop other addictive processes? Process addiction as an example.
Yeah. So oftentimes we see somebody that will have, an alcohol or drug dependence, and then they enter recovery, and then they form some other kind of addiction. So, like, for example, going back to what Lin was talking about earlier with the cigarettes or caffeine or food,
right.
I think food is actually a great example because oftentimes, it's another substance that you can put into your body, right? And a lot of times when people enter recovery, like Lin said, unfortunately, there is weight gain unless they're watching their diet and they're exercising. And unfortunately, we see a cycle where people gain weight. Oftentimes, then they'll get depressed. And then what do? They turn to drugs and alcohol to cope with their depression. Or perhaps in the back of their mind, they tell themselves, when I was drinking or when I was using, I wasn't eating like this, and it'll help me lose weight. So it can be almost like a gateway back into full-blown addiction. But yeah, also with other types of addictions, like gambling is a great example. That happens often.
Lynn, anything to add to that?
I think, people can develop, somewhat healthier ways to cope, such as like healthier ways to be addicted, right? Whether doing exercise,
Mhm.
doing, whatever is cooking, other healthier forms of addiction. But then I also have seen people, who started shopping excessively, right?
Mm.
Or who are really overworked, overscheduled. So those are, yes, they're not using alcohol and drugs, but it's something to watch out for.
What do you both consider as what do you see as the spectrum, so to speak, of alcohol use, and where's the line, when you need to consider if you're actually struggling with drinking or not?
Yeah. So, from clinical standpoint, there's alcohol abuse, which is like person may not be physiologically addicted, but they're psychologically craving it and, they're dependent, right? And there's alcohol dependence, which is what most people would describe as alcoholism. So, alcohol dependence, there is a range of mild, moderate to severe dependence. And the reason why it's important to recognize the spectrum is not to get so caught up with the labels and, enable people to be in denial together. It's more because when we see clients, especially when they're really resistant to get help, is that, that kind of like notion of, oh, if you don't accept that you're an alcoholic, you're not ready to get help, right? That really further removes them from like the direction that they need to go towards. So the reason why like recognizing that spectrum is important, especially when person is really resistant and they're not really, for whatever reason, they're not really ready to accept that identity. And the fine line is that, like if you have to drink, right? If you have the urge, you really need to drink and you drink to cope, drinking does something for you, right? Drinking to cope with negative emotions or stressors, or you suppress your feelings and your trauma because from your drinking. And I would say one of the things that is always shows up over and over is that once you start hiding or lying about drinking, that's usually when you really know that you have problems with alcohol.
Yeah.
And when we hear from patients all the time, Lynn, I really only drink wine, twice a month, or I don't drink every single day. The reason why it's really important to recognize the spectrum is that it's not necessarily the quantity or the frequency of drinking that is problematic, but how it affects you and how it really changes you and changes your life that really matters.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. And yeah, I'll add on to that a bit. So as I said earlier, just the term alcoholism or alcoholic can be very stigmatizing. And in addition, it's an umbrella term that gets tossed around a lot. And the thing about alcoholism is that it's not a one-size-fits-all category. So, for example, while someone may not be clinically diagnosable with alcohol use disorder, even in a mild case, this does not mean that they don't have a problem with alcohol.
Right.
So there are also terms like heavy drinker, binge drinker, problem drinker. And in all of these cases, it means that the individual has some kind of unhealthy relationship with alcohol. And so I think of a good example of, let's say there's a woman who is working a full-time job. She comes home, she takes care of her child, she puts her child to bed. And then, at the end of the night to unwind, she has one glass of wine. And, that's it, just one glass of wine. And she does that 7 days a week. Most people would not consider that an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, if there's nothing else going on. But let's say that same person, one night, there's no wine in the house and she's not able to have that one glass of wine. And, she starts having cravings and becomes preoccupied with drinking, and maybe she becomes anxious or panicky. Now, if she doesn't have any other symptoms, she still may not be clinically diagnosable. However, I think most would agree that that's an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. So there's like a huge spectrum of just from having minor problems with alcohol to full blown alcohol use disorder in severe cases. And I'll also add to that in relation to like when has someone crossed the line and knows that they have a problem. It's definitely a very difficult question to answer if the alcoholism is not so apparent and if it's not causing significant problems. one question that I always encourage people to ask themselves or their loved one is if their alcohol is negatively impacting any area of their lives. So I would look at everything from, relationships to career to their physical health, their mental health, their sleep hygiene, their general well-being, their general responsibilities, right? Like every area. And if alcohol is impacting any area of their life in a negative way, then it's definitely something that should be assessed further and perhaps examined with a mental health professional. And also one thing I'll add to that is that oftentimes we see that once somebody does come to treatment for their alcohol use, and once they've kind of accepted that it's a problem, when they look back, be it 5 years or 10 years or maybe even more, oftentimes they can see, little problems along the way, which at the time they may be attributed to an isolated event. So, for example, somebody might even have a significant consequence like a DUI or DWI, but, they might just attribute that to an isolated event. They had one too many drinks. They made the mistake of getting behind the wheel of a car, and that was that. And then they went on with their life. But if, I call these like little puzzle pieces. If these puzzle pieces start to add up and over time, it might put a puzzle together of, a more severe problem with alcohol. So, hindsight's always 20/20, but looking back, people are usually often able to see that there were problems along the way, right? Alcoholism doesn't just develop overnight. It happens over time.
Yeah. And to your point, Aaron, I think that the piece, especially around being cognizant of how this goes against, your own values, right? If you begin to think you're making choices that go against the person that you are, have become, or want to become, I think that that's a strong indicator right there. There's certainly some risks involved with drinking, especially as you brought that up about drinking and getting behind the wheel, because that's the thing with alcoholism. You get behind the wheel and you don't think that you're too intoxicated, and one lapse in judgment, man, it can change your life, and it can change the lives of other people. So
Absolutely.
there's a lot of, I think that's back to your, points that we talked about and covered at the beginning of the conversation around getting more in touch with yourself, with your body, with your mind, doing these things that are self-care related. And if you're more in tune with yourself, my guess is that if you start to notice yourself going off course, maybe it's high stress, maybe it's now, you're going to begin to notice those things a lot quicker versus if you're just more or less sort of detached, So I think this has been wonderful stuff that we've talked about today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Those are some really great questions, and thank you so much for having us on.
Yeah, thank you.
I appreciate you both for taking the time to come on the show with us today. And if you would like, you can find more information about Lin and Aaron's practice at familyaddictionspecialist.com. And also, if you know someone struggling with an addiction and are searching for answers, visit us at landmarkrecovery.com to learn more about substance abuse programs that are saving lives and empowering families. And until next week, I'm Zach Crouch with Landmark Recovery Radio. Hi, I'm Zach Crouch, and you're listening to Landmark Recovery Radio, your source for addiction and recovery news and knowledge. You can find us online wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe to get the most up-to-date information from leading experts. We have guest Katherine Middleton, therapist and licensed clinical social worker, joining us on the show today. In her private practice, Lionheart Trauma Support Services in Lexington, Kentucky, Kathy focuses on the impact trauma and addiction has on veterans and their families. Katherine, thank you so much for coming on the show with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, just curious, what inspired you to pursue a career in social work, and what moved you to focus really on service members and their families?
Well, I remember from a very young age that I needed to help my playground friends solve problems. So I had this awareness that felt like the people's hurts, pains, need for empathy, love, grace when needed. So I can remember distinct moments in childhood where I was loving on a friend who no one wanted to be around, or reporting child abuse to a teacher in fifth grade when a friend of mine reported she was being abused at home. So I can tell you that some part of it was just who I was. And I think some of it is what I also saw in my mom, who is a career military veteran, retired after 30 years. And then just seeing how my grandmother and both of my grandmothers, my maternal and my paternal grandparents, interacted with others. In fact, my paternal grandmother was a social worker, which we always kind of laughed about after I got my degree.
Got it.
Yeah.
So out on the playground, it was pretty early, it sounded like.
Yeah, it seems strange looking back now, I just think there was some innate born quality that just I gravitated towards that. I don't think I'm necessarily a superhuman or special human. I just remember those moments where I was the lending ear or the one helping somebody solve a problem, or loving, like I said, that person who was kind of lonely. Had these distinct memories of it. So that, I think, it just kind of put me in the path in the right direction. And then once I found social work, it just kind of made sense, what I was supposed to be doing.
Did you have brothers and sisters growing up in your house too?
I did. I had a sister who was 2 years younger than me, and then a brother who was 12 years younger than me.
Got it.
So we weren't a super big family, but we weren't small. And like I kind of mentioned, my mom was a military veteran, so was my dad. And so we, moved a lot and had to navigate adjusting to new school environments and new peers. And I remember a time my mom was single at the time. She was deployed to Kuwait for Desert Storm for 6 months and had to live with my grandmother for 6 months while she was gone. So I think that probably contributes to kind of that empathy and passion for others, because when you're in a military culture, you're stuck together, right? Everybody's kind of experiencing the same thing. Many of us aren't around family. When my mom deployed again, I can't remember where she went, and we were living with my stepdad was a part of the picture at the time, or still is, but she was off and we were home without her. And there were times he deployed and my mom was home. And so we, as a, military community, you work together, you stick together, you grieve together, you laugh together, you help each other. So
do you see any similarities with what we're going through right now with the coronavirus is, really putting a cap on a lot of activities that we are all doing, and we're all sort of in the in a similar experience because we're all having to cut back and do a lot of things differently. Is it at all similar in some respects to the military background that you're describing?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Just kind of watching each other, try to take care of each other. If someone's out of diapers and someone's going to the grocery store and there's diapers, if we know that this mom has trouble putting groceries on the table because of stress and deployments, or right now the coronavirus, of course we're, teaming up and trying to make sure people are taken care of in the community. It's very much like I remember the culture being, and you always had kind of a central hub, like a military wife or somebody who would kind of spearhead it, but it is definitely very much, and it's really nice. It's kind of comforting to see the way people are coming together. It reminds me a little bit after 9/11 when people kind of did some of that too.
I don't mean this in a crass kind of way at all, but it has been nice to simply reconnect in a different kind of way with people, because everybody's got something to talk about. We all have a similar experience. It's like, hey, how you doing? How are things going? And, what are you guys doing differently right now? And in some ways, it's really been sort of eye-opening just to see how much we disconnect.
Yeah, I agree. It's nice to see people come back together, especially
So,
in our very divided world that we've been living in, and just kind of seeing people connect on the humanistic level of, what do you
mhm.
need, or, this is what I need, or I'm afraid, or I'm worried, and everybody kind of just in some ways supporting each other through this time and encouraging through action. So,
So going back to this military service personnel that and families that you're working with, what are some of the obstacles that people who are coming from or certainly serving in the military face when they're seeking treatment?
well, a lot depends on kind of how they're classified, if they're active duty, reservist, guard, retired veteran, or out of the military. Depending on kind of what's going on with each, there's different kinds of obstacles.
Mm.
Seeking services can impact security clearances. If they're like a reservist, a guard, even an active duty, if you're a federal employee and you have a high security clearance and you go get any treatment other than family counseling, then that can impact your record. It can impact you maintaining or continuing in your career.
Wow.
Yeah, they can decide if you're not fit for duty. And if you're not fit for duty, that can impact whether you're allowed to reenlist, you're
Mm.
forced to get out. Um, let's say you have 17 years or 16 years in the
Sure.
active duty and you need services, but it could impact you and it could force you out for some reason. Well, you've got 4 more years until retirement. 16
Hmm.
years is gone.
Hmm.
So it just really depends a little bit on kind of what branch you're in, what you're doing, what your leadership looks like.
Hmm.
If you've got very supportive leadership, they may be more apt to support your decision to go seek services and it not have a negative impact on your career. So there's just so many different obstacles to getting treatment.
Yeah.
Um, and then the other thing is sometimes, members who may try to get treatment, and if there any kind of divorce situation or divorce comes up,
Hmm.
then, can the attorneys in the divorce case try to bring up
Mm.
their
Hmm.
mental
Hmm.
health or substance abuse
Hmm.
against them? And so there's just like so many different obstacles.
Factors, right?
Yeah, it's just not so simple as, this branch does this, or this reservist does this, or this veteran does this, and
Hmm.
it's very more complicated, and it's harder, I think, sometimes for them to get services. The other
Absolutely.
thing is, yeah, and the other thing is female veterans.
Hmm.
They're sometimes underrepresented, and there are a lot of times underrepresented. So sometimes they may be harder to reach, or maybe challenges for them to reach out for services or support,
Hmm.
because their trauma could be related to military sexual trauma. There's
Hmm.
a significant
Hmm.
percentage of female veterans with PTSD who come from military sexual trauma. So depending on if they're going through an organization that they're required to participate in groups with men, or if
Hmm.
they have to disclose things in front of male peers, or if they have to go to their superiors in their active duty and asking for support, but then maybe the person who victimized them is still a part of the unit. So what do they
Yeah.
do then? Um, and
So let's
then,
talk
women.
about that. I had some questions just
Sure.
as you're kind of explaining how that piece unfolds, especially in regards to the military sexual trauma. How do you, Kathy, as a person who's treating this individual, let's just say that they are back from their deployment and they're going to go back again, most likely.
Mhm.
How do you help them find their voice in this, particularly for females who probably don't feel like they have a voice, and how do you advocate for them and help them advocate for themselves?
I think the first step for any sexual assault victim, and even this population, is just giving them the opportunity to tell their story and say that
Hmm.
we believe them, and believing them and being told that we believe you. Some will not want to come forward. some will not want to advocate for them, advocate in a way that means come forward and go through a legal process. So really what we try to do more than anything is we want to let them know they're heard. And then we want to support them through the journey of what do they want to do? What will that look like for them? And then therapy is really helpful. We have some evidence-based models that can reduce and eliminate PTSD, anxiety, depression in 1 to 5 sessions. So by healing some of that, then they can have maybe power to go back in and deal with it a different kind of way. Mm-hmm. We always want to make sure that the female always knows that they have that option to do what they want to do, that we are not going to pressure them to report, to take someone, to court, or but if that's what they want to do, we will stand beside them, we will advocate for them, and we will connect them with the right resources. So if it's like a veteran and they need to connect with somebody, say on a military base, that's their role is sexual victim advocacy, mm-hmm. then we would do that. But I think a lot depends on what that female wants to do. And like I said, the first thing I think is just acknowledging that it's happened and you can tell us and sure. We're not going to judge. And because there's so many circumstances that could lead up to a sexual abuse that a female may internalize that and take that on as themselves. Like I wrote a paper, and one of the things that through the research indicated that, people would use, like you would go on a deployment and women, mm-hmm. Superiors or supervisors would say things like, if you'll have sex with me, I'll keep you on base in this safe area. But if you don't, I'm going to send you on this convoy.
It kind of sounds to me like prison almost in that respect, because you go into a prison, especially if you're not super, and I'm talking about prison here. Sure. If you're not super savvy, street savvy, if you're not big and you don't know how to defend yourself, then there's a good chance that you're going to get groomed and picked up by someone who can do those mm-hmm. things for you.
Yeah.
Would you agree with it? That there's parallels here, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And sometimes there's not as many, like, so on a deployment, there may be only 1 to, 5, 10 maybe at most out of 100 people mm-hmm. deployed that are female. So they have limited support maybe within their unit as far as female, support. And then there's always an idea that sometimes women feel like they have to prove themselves as equal to their mm-hmm. man or their male counterpart. Mm-hmm. And so then they don't want to report. They don't want to create problems. And then the other obstacle to reporting is, let's say I have to deploy with this unit again, or this is my unit at home. And if I go and start telling the chain of command what happened, 1, are they going to believe me? Mm. 2, if they do believe me, what is that going to do to the unit? Is that mm-hmm. going to just divide a unit and we're about to go back to war? So is it better for me to say nothing than...
Because then it's all my fault, possibly. If in that person's eyes, at least, they might be mm-hmm. just simply choked to be able to talk to somebody, because that might be in their head. Like, I'm going to cause all this disruption. I can't do that.
Yeah. And so it's not so, and we, like I said, our goal is to support the female veteran however they need support and give them the advocates the voice. And we'll do what they need us or want us to do to help them through the process. But I do think in some ways female veterans have a little bit more complex dynamics and how to figure out, how do I come forward? What will be the consequences? And they're probably thinking about these things. And it's probably not been over the past 5-10 years, maybe say about 10 years, they started to really kind of address this type of trauma in the military.
Well, I'm glad that you bring that up, because I was doing some research this afternoon just before we talked on the amount of just suicides that are among the general population, and at least for women, among every 100,000 people within the general population, there's 5.2 for every 100,000 among women, females who have not served. Now, if you take that into account versus females who have served, that number goes from 5.2 for every 100,000 to 28.7. Now that's huge. And with men, it's around 20.9 for those who haven't served, and it jumps up to 32.1. So the problem is definitely there, right? And
Yeah.
I'm just so glad to hear that you're helping get in front of this, because what we talked about earlier, Katie, that there's among at least vets, there's 22 suicides per day right now. That's about a suicide every hour, roughly.
Right. Yes, there is approximately 22 veterans who commit suicide daily, and it's not always clear the ratio to male to female, how many are female, how many are male committing suicide. But it's staggering considering a lot of the active fighting has decreased over the past several years, and yet we're still seeing so many veterans commit suicide, particularly in VA hospital parking lots. So there's a scream for help, and I think we're missing it in some ways on getting these individual support and services quickly and efficiently.
I want to focus a little bit too on the family members, because this is a big piece of what you do in your practice at Lionheart Trauma Support Services. What are the biggest stressors you think family members face when their loved one is suffering from a trauma-based addiction or disorder?
Well, they themselves can wind up developing, trauma from it, anxiety, depression. Trauma symptoms and addiction can become very much a family disease and disorder. They're left to kind of adapt and cope and navigate new situations with the veteran. So the veteran coming home, they've had these long deployments or separations for different periods of time. So they're having to readjust in some way of getting to know each other again. Maybe the family's lives kind of continue moving forward, and here comes this veteran who's coming home for good, having to adapt and readjust. The family's trying to figure out how to adapt and readjust. And then when you have the PTSD symptoms and the addiction kind of coming in, and if there's medical staff, any kind of, amputee, or so they're having to kind of manage medical support and help their loved one. And then TBIs are not very evident, so they're having to adjust to outbursts and these behaviors that just seem odd or strange maybe to the family members. So you can see, families beginning to kind of take on the stress. They can get caregiver fatigue. You may see children not really kind of understanding, this isn't my dad or my mom when they left. Who is this person? And so they start kind of developing distorted and irrational thinking on themselves, like, what did I do wrong? Why can't I make my dad or mom happy? And then, and then if you have like an explosive veteran who is just because of PTSD and anxiety and stuff like that, then the child then kind of moves into that hypervigilant state of fight, flight, or freeze. I don't know how my dad's going to be today.
Is this where that art of rapid recovery comes in for you? Do you work with accelerated resolution therapy a lot in your practice on these kinds of cases that you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. So
can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, it's image-based, and what it says is images create problems, sensations, and feelings, and they're kind of locked on your limbic system. That's the danger system. And if we can kind of shift that off the limbic system, it can change the way you feel and operate and process the world around you. And it's really quick, and you don't have to talk about your trauma, which a lot of people like, which is really great for veterans, because when they come in, they don't necessarily want to tell you what they had to do in Iraq, Afghanistan, or whatever. And so they just kind of have to follow the instructions of the therapist. It's similar to EMDR, but it's a little quicker from what we have seen. And it's a shift. That's the best I can kind of describe it. And it really works. I did it on my car accident. When I was 16, I did that about 2 years ago, I did it. And
that kind of propelled you anyway to also get into this field. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes. I did suffer from PTSD and anxiety from a major car accident I had when I was 16. And, there's this whole way of how this model helps and differently than like your traditional talk therapy. That traditional talk therapy is just kind of like a tells you how to cope and deal with your triggers, and gives you
Mm.
coping skill challenge, irrational thinking. With
Doesn't really
ART,
get to the heart of the matter, though.
yeah, it's really powerful. And when people get done at the end of the session, they are able to kind of immediately see through this kind of scale that we give them. They're immediately able to see their symptoms decrease pretty quickly, or what
That's
has
fantastic.
decreased. Yeah, there is research, peer review research of this being used on veterans and its effectiveness. So it is evidence-based.
And there was a
And it can
TED
help.
Talk, I think, on your website in regards to this particular form of therapy. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. Lainey is the one who created the model, and she has a TED Talk on the website. There's also on YouTube a TED Talk, a YouTube video on a veteran who went through it as well, and he kind of tells his story about from when he kind of started it, and then after he did a couple of sessions, and just how much his life has improved significantly.
Does the VA use this a lot, Katherine?
No, unfortunately, they do not. They use cognitive processing therapy and EMDR primarily.
Okay.
There is some research out there that's doing like a dual research with them to kind of with CPT, cognitive processing therapy, and accelerated therapy. I don't see that research being completed for probably another year or so.
Okay.
But we do have a significant amount of military clinicians getting trained in the model. So it is, I think Walter Reed is starting to use it some too. So it is beginning to get known, but it's still relatively new compared to some of the other models that are out there.
How do you recommend people find local treatment that works for them if they don't really know where to start?
I think the first thing to do is just to recognize that they're not alone. There are great nonprofits, mental health providers like us, substance abuse programs like you, Landmark Recovery, who provide exceptional services. I think seeking help can be hard depending on kind of what the circumstances of each member is, or is a part of.
Yeah, as you brought up earlier, especially if you're in a top position, because there's a lot at stake, it sounds like.
Yeah. So, if you connect with the right providers, they can assist you in navigating through some of that without having to worry about there being consequences. So, like, one of the things I would probably first encourage is people to reach out to their military communities, like the people who are in it, just kind of like recovery communities. They do really well with people who understand, who have experiences like-minded experiences. They can relate better. And then just like in the veteran community, if you have some veterans that say this is a great organization, you should check them out, then another veteran's more likely to listen and respect that, what that veteran has to say, than maybe somebody in an outsider position. So sometimes connecting with your local groups, there's some great like online social media groups that can kind of help point people. There's a great organization called Save a Warrior. They do a lot of work of helping people connect. They have a great program. And then, there's always the VA. There's not a lot, sometimes there's mistrust in the VA, but there is the VA. Military One Source is a great option. They can connect you to local providers who accept their insurance. And then
How does that work? Real quick questions. Just so if someone does want to seek services outside of the VA, and they are military and they've got, let's just say, VA benefits or TRICARE, are there a lot of hoops to jump through to seek outside services other than the VA?
It just depends. If they have VA benefits, yes. A lot of times you have to be considered a contractor to be eligible to accept the VA benefits, and it's a process that you have to go through with the VA. If they take TRICARE, not necessarily. The problem is when you start moving out into communities that you have providers who don't take TRICARE, that gets challenging. I can say that Lionheart, we take TRICARE, first of all, and then second of all, we try to offer support, mental health support, to anybody who, even if they can't afford it. So we try to do sliding scale fees. We try to do pro bono. But yeah, tends to be some obstacles to get outside VA. And then if you're a military member and you are near a military base, then they may require you to see a provider on base versus, say, a provider off base. And so, that can hinder treatment, because if they do choose to go off base, then they're going to have to pay out of pocket for that expense. So there's definitely obstacles, but I know that there are a lot of great providers out there that do not necessarily want money, or whether you have benefits, to be an obstacle to getting help, and if you need it. And then if you can find somebody who understands military culture, kind of some of the obstacles I've talked about, like I said, those providers will work really hard to reduce risk to their career, those kinds of things, risk to their retirement, risk to, there's definitely ways we can do that, minimize without, impacting them significantly.
Fantastic.
So there is an event. There's an event coming up in Lexington, June 12th and 13th, in Lexington, as long as it doesn't get canceled. It's called the Veterans Engagement Action Center event, and this is where there will be many local providers and VA representatives to help connect folks to services, answer questions about benefits, sign them up for services, and so on. It's free to all veterans, guard, reservist, family, dependent, caregivers, and survivors. There will be more information on my website regarding this. I do believe.
Where is that being held at, Katherine?
It's going to be at Lexington Christian Academy here in Lexington, Kentucky.
Got it.
Yeah, and I think Landmark will also be there too.
Awesome. Very, very good. Well, this is great. Wonderful information about especially what to do if you are a military family and you are seeking help for your loved one, or if you're active duty or a vet and you need to seek out some help. The thing that came up for me, especially as you were talking about traumatic brain injuries, is, I think that is something that we're going to continue to see more and more as people come back from active duty. And to me, at least, it seems like that is, it's both psychological, but there's also some biological effects on the brain that happen during that. Is there certain people that are specialized in treating that? Do you have to go on and really sort of understand TBI a lot more to be able to effectively treat it?
Yeah, because with the biological aspects, it's really important to understand how the different parts of the brain works, and if you have an injury that to a specific side or area of the brain, how does that impact your ability to function, cope, manage, assess danger, manage emotions, and so it definitely is important to have some level of awareness of how that impacts individuals. And that's the other thing we have to look at when we're treating with TBI and medical injuries, and kind of going back to that addiction, is, how many are these veterans kind of being treated with medication to manage some of their injuries that are turning into addictions? And then, are they addressing both the mental health component and the physical component, or is it just the physical and now it's turned into something bigger because now they're, self-medicating and their mental health is not getting addressed appropriately? And then the TBIs can look, you have someone who may all of a sudden start being aggressive and kind of lashing out or crying one minute, and this person no longer knows how to deal with these TBIs, and so now they're using drugs and alcohol to manage, and then they go to a doctor and that TBI is never addressed. It's now like, oh, you have this issue, versus we're not treating the underlying TBI that's contributing to some mental health obstacles.
Absolutely.
So there's just so much to the veteran population. It impacts their overall well-being and opportunities.
As we're talking about, I guess TBI and parallels with the military and other parts of our culture, I tend to think also about those sports, contact sports, football being a perfect example. I think of this, where there was a recent documentary on Netflix on Aaron Hernandez, and they did a biopsy. Or not a bi- They basically, when he passed away, I think he's committed suicide too. They looked at the inside of his brain, and there was a hole that I could have probably stuck my pinky finger through, and that was through constant, either mental illness, but also, the drugs that he was taking, but also the amount of hits that he incurred in his career as a football player. And now, granted, he probably had some other things going on, but still,
Sure.
That's alarming when you take a look at that and what could be going on with our current military vets in active duty.
Absolutely. I agree. I do feel in some ways it's probably best practice to have, someone in some levels be rule in, rule out TBIs as potentially contributing to some of the symptoms they're having. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case, or there's definitely PTSD and there's other contributing factors, but I think if there is potential for a TBI, it should be evaluated and educated. The more education a person has, sometimes it helps manages their symptoms, and it gives the family a place to say, okay, he is not angry at me because I broke the plate on accident.
Right.
It's just that his brain, the way his brain operates, and so I'm going to have to learn how to handle this differently versus maybe telling my partner to get over it because this is being silly. So I think a lot of times, even for our military families, just education for the veteran themselves, and true education, not drive-by education that sometimes they get when they get home from deployment and they get like this briefing, and then we it needs to be checked in, and we need to, the families feel like there's some oh, this doesn't look right. Who do I talk to? And having those things in place.
We really owe it to them and the families to invest in that time and resources. There's no question about that.
Absolutely.
I think it's something that we take very seriously too at our facility, where the family is the family piece that we do each Saturday. It's an entire day from 9 a.m. till 4 or 5 p.m. The family comes and gets a education on the dynamics of the family, the genetics, the epigenetics of addiction. They have a piece to feel safe and talk about this with their loved one, and it's moderated by a therapist who's trained in this and understands it. So I think that, to draw a parallel again to the military, this isn't going to stop. This is something that's going to continue, and we need to be prepared, and we need to be able to invest that back into our loved ones, family members in active military duty.
Absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly. And there's definitely organizations out there. Unfortunately, I cannot remember the one that sometimes supports Save a Warrior for families, but there are definitely organizations out there that, support the whole family through this process. It's just a matter of these families making sure that they reach out for help, or knowing who to ask, how to ask, what to look for. It goes back to that education, what to look for, and then just kind of connecting people and finding ways to connect to these resources. Yeah.
So Kathy, for more information on your particular practice, Lionheart Trauma Support Services, people can visit the website at lionhearttraumasupportservices.com. Is there a phone number that they could call as well?
Yes, they can call at 859-447-0855. There's also access through the website to contact us through the website directly. And I am open to receiving any kind of emails for any of our veterans who are seeking services, don't know where to begin, don't know how to find it. And even if they're not local, I will work diligently to connect them with the people in the right areas. All they have to do is just kind of reach out to me, and I will help in any way possible.
We appreciate that.
Yeah, they can use that contact form if they need to, or just, I don't remember if the email is directly on there, but they can always email directly if it's available.
Fantastic. I just want to thank you so much for your work and your service in coming on the show today. And if you know someone struggling with an addiction and are searching for answers, visit us at landmarkrecovery.com to learn more about substance abuse programs that are both saving lives and empowering families. And until next week, I'm Zach Crouch with Landmark Recovery Radio, wishing you well.
Thank you for tuning in to Recovery Radio. New content for this program is available every Friday, with all episodes available on demand here on the Voice America Variety channel and through our content partners, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Google Play podcasts. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review so we can continue to create quality content to help save 1 million lives in the next 100 years. You don't need to struggle through addiction alone. Live the life you dreamed on the road to recovery.